turns, we make it clear.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Spacepower Podcast, the official podcast of the Space Force Association. I'm your host, Bill Wolf, the founder and CEO of the association, the only association solely dedicated to supporting our U.S. Space Force Guardians and their families. On this podcast, what we do is explore the people, technologies, and ideas shaping the future of space power. Today, I'm joined by two innovators who are helping redefine what it means to build and maintain a sustainable presence on orbit. Kulshrestha and George Freney, co-founders of Space Machines Company based in Australia. Their mission is to create a future where satellites can be serviced, refueled, and supported in space, unlocking the infrastructure needed for a truly sustainable space economy. Raj, George, welcome to the show. Thanks so much for taking time.
Thank you for having us.
Bill, thanks very much for having us. Really delighted to be here and love the work that Space Force Association is doing.
Really appreciate that, George. Thanks so much. And thanks for being a new member of the Space Force Association. But let's start at the beginning. What inspired you both to launch Space Machines Company? And what was the aha moment that made you realize on-orbit servicing was the next big frontier?
Oh, well, let me take that one, Hippie. Back in 2018, Raj called me at about 10 p.m. at night in about October 2018. We'd worked together for many years before that on technology startups. And he said, George, I think we need to build a space company. Space is the new frontier. Everything's changing up there. Its importance to the world is incredibly high. We're going to be needing new capabilities in orbit to safeguard space, to be able to do logistics in space, to service spacecraft, to maybe even manufacture stuff in space. Back in 2018, that all sounded very futuristic. And me in my normal way said, yeah, sure, Raj, let's do that. Let's start. So October 2018, we started thinking about that. By early 2019, we'd founded a company called Space Machines Company. We're starting to really think through that. And, the world was really different in 2019. By 2022-23, we started to have insight into the sort of space superiority problem and the geopolitical situation, the absolute fundamental importance of a resilient space architecture, and became very purposefully obsessed with the need to build capabilities in orbit that assure space superiority and safeguard space for everybody. So that's my side of the story, but grab Raj's side of the story. I think is really important as well.
Look, I think when we think about starting the company, one of the very interesting things we saw, and I think as a whole, as globally, we see this is a really interesting time. Air domain transition from being something that we all experimented with and explored with to becoming commercially important 100 years ago. I think about 7 years ago, with what was happening with launch, the cost to access space was dipping drastically. And that meant that there would be a lot more infrastructure being put in space, and space would be integrated into the human economy, to say. And for us, that was super important because cost to access space decreasing meant that the cost to sustain in orbit remains high. And we've got to figure out a way to drop that. So when you start thinking about putting a lot of infrastructure into orbit, how do you monitor it? How do you inspect it? How do you protect it? That's going to become super important. So I think that was the kernel of starting to think about the problem and how do you lower the cost of movement in orbit, and that driving the space economy. And I think security forms a really central and core part of that.
I think if I just add a little bit to that, Hippie, that I think is really important, and it's sort of realized in the last maybe 12 months, was that this massive reduction in cost of on-orbit maneuverability, right? Getting the cost per delta V down as low as possible, whether it's enabling national security style use cases or civilian government or commercial ones, is the cheaper and faster you can move around in orbit and do activities close to other objects, whether those objects are friendly, foes, or space junk. That is a really powerful thing to be able to get into place. And, that really is what drives us now. And that aha moment, like mass-produced, highly maneuverable spacecraft are super important for national security and civilian and commercial use cases.
No, perfect. Thank you for that perspective. Really do appreciate it. Now, you each come from very different backgrounds. Raj with a deep technical foundation in satellite engineering and systems design, and George with a background in tech entrepreneurship and digital innovation. How have those perspectives complemented one another as you've built this company?
Raj, why don't you take this one first?
Um, Look, I think from my perspective, what I think about technically, having trained as an aerospace engineer and spent a lot of time in both software and now hardware. From my perspective, when I look at space, space has always been a very tech intense domain. For the last 50 years, it's been very specialized. And I think what we have learned in other domains, when you start to think about automotive, you think about biotech, you think about software. I think all of the progress that's been made in those areas is starting to democratize space. You're starting to think about, space not being this very special technical domain that only a few can access, but it becoming more commoditized. And as we do that, as the costs drop, how do you build good technology? How do you start to take what we have built, the industrial base that we built on Earth, and start to leverage that to the benefit of space? And so I think it's a time of deep transition because for 50 years, engineers have trained to build this very specialized systems. And in doing so, created almost a silo and sometimes an ivory tower on how we think about solving problems. 10 years down the track from today, I believe you would have, sort of repair centers in cities where you could build satellites and repair them and get them ready for flight. So there is a future where space is just another domain for which we build technology. So from my perspective, having that experience and worked in other adjacent domains brings a different lens to space rather than have spent all of my time in space. So I think everyone, every engineer, every accountant, every marketing person, space is just another domain, and I think for us that's super important.
And hippie for me, I'd never thought about space or military sort of defense concepts until we started this company. And I think the fact that I'd never thought about it actually is part of why we've imagined the future the way we have, because we're unconstrained. Well, I'm particularly unconstrained about sort of the old way of doing things. And what that means is that, I love to think about very complex systems of systems, and I'm always trying to find the right solution from a system perspective to solve big complex problems. That's what I love. And then as a result of not knowing a lot about space engineering and what's going on in space and national security, I just listen to what people are talking about all the time, whether it's, the warfighters, in America, in Australia, in the UK that we talk to, and just imagining what the ideal future state for how a resilient space architecture could work. And then once we get our head around that, well, how the hell do we build it, right? And then it's the mindset to be able to build a team and believe in what that future should be so that you can get stakeholders to believe in it with you. And I think not being from space, not being from the defense world has actually served our purpose in being able to imagine what a different future state can look like more effectively than others might have been able to.
Yeah, it's important. What you both talk about is being unbiased and not coming from that culture where you've not been programmed into believing things are only done a certain way. And what you're talking about is, hey, let's be innovative. And why can't we do this? And what if? And so the more questions that we can ask about what if, I think it benefits everybody. So it sounds like that's exactly what you brought to your company and the respective backgrounds that you each bring. Now let's talk about the technology aspect of it because it's pretty exciting. Your Optimus mission drew global attention as one of the largest commercial satellites built in Australia. Can you walk us through what that mission was designed to achieve?
Yeah.
Well, why don't I just pick that up first quickly, Raj, and then get you into the more technical details, which I can't talk about. I think if 270 kilo class spacecraft, it was the largest single spacecraft ever built in Australia and launched. That launched last March on transporter out of Vandenberg. The primary purpose of that whole activity was to demonstrate that an Australian team could be put together to design, qualify, and launch a spacecraft of that size and do it incredibly cost effectively, and in a reasonably good timeline. And that was the primary mission. I think we did a really amazing job of getting that done with very constrained resources, right? Like, one of the things about Australia is that there's not a lot of money floating around for space down here. We're a little envious of looking over to the US and seeing how much money floats around in space. But that was the primary purpose, right? Design, build, qualify, build all the systems and capabilities to get something into orbit. And on that, I'll hand over to Raj, because he can talk a lot more about the technology side of that.
Yeah, so as George mentioned, the purpose was that building a 250 kilo class spacecraft that Australia had never done before. And so not only did we have to build the infrastructure to build a spacecraft like that, but then build the spacecraft itself. So I think for us, it was really about learning to build. The first mission was, and I remember telling the team back then that, for us, 95% success is if you can integrate this whole vehicle and take it to the launch pad. And, if we launch it and it sort of reaches orbit, that's another 3%. And if it does everything we want it to do, that's the 2% remaining. And so I think from our perspective, building it, getting the supply chain sorted, starting to building our knowledge base of how to build systems like that, where we've not had a heritage of space that some of the other countries have had, US, for example, the last 60, 70 years. And so I think from our perspective, putting together a vehicle that represents a low cost spacecraft that can deliver and maneuver in orbit was the primary mission. And so to that end, propulsion, avionics, comms, putting that all together, learning to be working with big launchers like SpaceX, getting the spacecraft there, and then being able to have a team that can operate that spacecraft. So from our perspective, that was a massive learning exercise just to get to the launch pad.
And that's perfect. You talk about learning and the opportunity to take something away from every launch, which I think many companies are starting to figure out is, regardless of where we get to in the process, we're going to learn something from it, which is exactly the type of leaning forward and innovation that we need. So even with some of those challenges following launch and the opportunity to learn those key takeaways, what were the biggest that you took away, and how have they shaped your next steps?
The biggest learning we had with rollout was how do we start thinking about not just building, launching the spacecraft, but how do we want to operate it? And the major problem, when we look at terrestrial systems, the ability to communicate is a very straightforward linear thinking process. But with space, you got to have rightly positioned ground stations. You've got to have them spread across the globe. You've got to make sure that there's redundancies on back of redundancies as far as communication. So for us, that enhanced fault tolerance in how we design missions for space, and how do we really think about and learn to think about a domain that is in some way still foreign to us. It's not like air and land and sea. It is still an unknown that is becoming more known, but it's still emerging. So for us, that was a big part of it. We also strengthened our testing protocols. How do we test better? How do we look at all different modes of failure? How do we increase that? And I think the biggest thing for us that emerged from that was that you've got to weigh up cost versus reliability of transfer to space. And what I mean by that is, on one hand, you've got SpaceX providing rideshare missions, and it's a bit like a bus. And it comes with all the benefits and all of the cons of being on a bus. You get released together. It's really hard to find yourself once you're, all released at the same time in orbit. And that comes with their own sets of challenges in the early operations part of the space missions. And on the other hand, you've got dedicated missions that cost you a lot more, but you have some certainty in where your spacecraft is being positioned and where it's being dropped off. And so how do we start to think about a diverse access to space strategy? So, where do we use rideshare for fast responsive space? Where do we use dedicated? How do you balance the two to get the right outcomes for customers?
I think, and I'd just add to that, Raj, a lot of those learnings have rolled their way into Optimus Viper. The second block 2 of the design of our spacecraft. We're launching a space mastery mission late 2026, which is a collaborative mission with the Indian Space Agency and the Australian Space Agency, launching on an NSIL rocket out of India, which will allow us to put some of that learning and capability into an on-orbit test. And I think, Raj mentioned it, but the ability to mass manufacture these, the learnings we got out of this, and how do you actually pull this cost down, make these at a larger volume, sometimes not as reliable as, exquisite systems, but how do you produce these and build a capability to produce these at volume? And some of the key learnings that we've taken out of that could become strategic advantages for us.
Yeah, that's phenomenal. And you talked about on-orbit logistics, and we can start to coin a phrase, roadside assistance in space, if you want to think about it that way. It's a truly fascinating concept. So what kinds of services are you developing, and what level of demand are you seeing from commercial and government partners?
Yeah, I'm going to pick that one, George, and just thinking about, as when you think about the first things that's got to happen in orbit when there is a threat of any sort, or an issue that emerges, I think just like terrestrially, you want the first responder. You want that first responder to get out there very quickly and understand what's happening. And so at the moment when things go wrong in orbit, you can look at it from a distance, from 400, 300, 200 kilometers. It's just too expensive to get there. And even if you can get there, it's super cost prohibitive, and we don't have coverage across the entire orbital planes. And so for us, what was really important was that even before you can start thinking about logistics, being able to get very close to a target object and being able to conduct operations is super key. And so for us, that was the first step. For example, when you think about orbital servicing, some of our commercial customers, if there is something that goes wrong with their satellites, you don't want to send out a life extender because you don't know whether the satellite needs a life extender. And so our premise was the ability to rapidly respond at low cost to get there, and then understand and characterize what the problem is, and then being able to supply that to stakeholders, whether they're commercial, whether they're national security, whether they are long-term infrastructure owners. What do you do next? And so very similar to, if your car breaks down, you don't call a tow truck. You call AAA, who can get out there, figure out what's going on, either get you back on the road or call somebody else for help. So from our perspective, it's the step 0 for logistics to say, how do we get at a very low cost, very fast, to a place where an object is at threat.
That's right. And I might just add on to that from the demand side sort of perspective, Hippie. The demand that we're seeing from the national security customer, whether that's in the US, the UK, European countries, India, South Korea, Japan, maybe even Australia in due course, it's accelerated incredibly rapidly in 2025. You're seeing a lot of demand signal coming out from that. I genuinely believe if we could manufacture 100 of our spacecraft per year and they were qualified and at a reliability level that was suited at the price point we're talking about, they would probably be purchased immediately, right? I think there is an immediate pressing need from the national security customer, and we plan on selling that in a sort of system model where there's hardware and software, and they take the system and they can integrate payloads into it and start to use it the way they want. From a commercial perspective, we are actually starting to see some emerging demand, whether it's from data center operators, space station operators, high data, like even people directing sunlight in orbit. If you've got a high value asset in orbit, you really want to be able to ensure that you can inspect it from multiple angles and protect it at a really cheap price point. And if that cheap price point's cheap enough, then it starts to unlock the economics of that sort of inspection and protection service. And we would envision a future state where you're providing that as a service, like Roadside Assist, the AAA in the US. You've got a subscription, you call them out to come and do an inspection and a bit of protection work, a bit like Roadside Assist / security control van, right? You're providing a bit of deterrence and a bit of data inspection, which actually starts to change the economics and the reliability and resilience of that critical on-orbit infrastructure. So I think as you see this acceleration in on-orbit infrastructure and an acceleration of the threat to that on-orbit infrastructure, this becomes an absolute necessity.
I think I think to George's point, and I really think about your question before around sustainability and what that means in this context. Um, when we think about sustainability, space is one of the first domains where, as humanity, we've had I guess in some way a luxury to think about sustainability before proliferation. People were like, well, we're going to build satellites that last very long, can be refueled. The challenge is the economics is not there. And so in some way, space cannot be an exclusive domain where that rule shifts. Every other domain has followed proliferation, exploitation, commercialization, and then sustainability. And our view is that our approach of we're going to mass produce spacecraft that can provide this capability means that once you proliferate this, you lower the cost of maneuvering in orbit. And once you do that, you can then be sustainable. So I think in some way, when you look at a lot of mass production of spacecraft for the future thesis, there is this counterpoint to say, well, is that sustainable? And you think about Kessler syndrome and the rest of it. But I think it has to proliferate before it can sustain. And I think we've got to be responsible, but at the same time, it's got to follow that the economics will only work when the cost of building and cost of launching and cost of maneuvering gets super low.
Thank you both for that perspective. When you think about all of the attributes, propulsion, guidance, autonomy, how is Space Machines approaching those challenges differently from other players in the field?
That's a great question. I think we've taken a software first approach. I think we have thought about our spacecraft as attritable platforms, consumables that, by virtue of software defined autonomy that spread across distributed spacecraft, you get resilience. The ability to command and control extremely low cost, reliable but yet functional and consumable spacecraft. And that means that when we think about guidance and we think about propulsion, the major metric is low cost against unit reliability, and that unit reliability versus system reliability. So, as you think about one spacecraft, if you want to make it 100% reliable, you are now spending a lot of money in building that spacecraft with the best parts, trying to reduce that risk, and then you get exquisite, long time to build platforms. And our approach to that has been, what is the minimum amount of reliability you need at a unit level that gives a system 100% or 99.2 or 99.5 reliability by virtue of numbers. And so being able to take that strategy and apply that not only at the system level, but then drop it down to all the way to component level. And a great example of that is our Scintilla propulsion engine, which we're now producing at between $20,000 to $30,000 a unit that can then be plugged onto the spacecraft. At that point, it becomes consumable. And so for us, taking that philosophy, everything from a component level and then onto subsystems and then onto guidance and being software enabled brings a very different and a very almost automotive type approach to spacecraft building.
So I think the only add that I can, add to that, Hibby, I'm not the deep technical engineer, is the importance of this vertical integration and sort of reliability trade space to hitting a price point and mass production with a resilient supply chain. It's really important to us that we can tap into a non-traditional space supply chain to meet the production requirements and have the supply chain resilience and security needed to produce at the price point and at the volume that we need to for this resilient architecture to be put in place in the timeline we want.
Thank you, gentlemen. Before I transition over to industry impact and future strategy, just from your perspective, is it the intent to have a cache of these satellites that you're creating ready to launch? Or is it another thought to have some of these satellites already pre-positioned on orbit, ready to be dispensed?
That's a great question. I think when you think about building really low-cost spacecraft, you don't want to be launching them from ground every single time. And so our belief is that you're going to have forward deployed depots of these satellites pre-positioned in strategic and commercially relevant spots in orbit, to be ready to be deployed, ready to be tasked. And so for us, the model has to be the concept of an orbital warehouse, where you are starting to position these assets up ahead, and then renewing and replenishing them at regular intervals, so that there is that. And that, I think, brings us back to the logistics learning that we've had in other domains is, how do you create a logistics network and distribution centers at the edge? And so for us, that's part of the core strategy.
No, that's great. No, and I think everyone's thinking that way as well. Now we just got to proliferate that
Yes.
thought process.
Yes.
So when you talk, so I'd like to pivot now a little bit and talk about Australia's space industry and the fact that it's grown significantly over the past decade. Been strong advocates for building sovereign capability there. Why is that so important? And how do you see Australia's role evolving in the global space ecosystem?
Yeah. George, do you want me to go first?
I'll grab that one first, Raj, and then you come in and line it out. I spent a lot of time with the Australian government and thinking through some of this. Look, Australia is an incredibly important location in the world. It's sort of positioned in the Indo-Pacific, and therefore how it relates to the Indo-Pacific Command. There's strategic aspects to a lot of the location of Australia in terms of space and data transfer from space to Earth. And I think as a partner, like as an ally of America and as part of the AUKUS framework and the Five Eyes, it's essential that Australia is building sovereign capability. It's building a consistent space ecosystem with launch return, which is starting to happen. We're seeing Gilmore Space building rockets, and Southern Launch is now doing returns for Varda. So the ability for Australia to be a strong, resilient part of the architecture of how production of spacecraft is executed, I think, is a very, very important part of our future in ensuring that the Allies maintain space superiority. I think that, Australia's got an incredible amount of talent and innovation. And I think, unfortunately, it doesn't have the same depth of capital and the consistency of customer demand, which is probably slowing down its development more than it should. But I think the way that the Australian innovators and entrepreneurs are looking globally from day one in respect of how they think about growing their companies is really, really important.
Thank you, George. Any add-ons, Raj?
Look, I think from my perspective, given the geopolitics that is at least in the last 18 to 24 months, I think having a doctrine of how do, especially from the US side as well, how do we enable partners and allies to be resilient in themselves, because with their resilience comes, the resilience of the allies, and that shifting message of we have to make sure that all the allies are self-reliant and resilient in themselves to be part of a resilient network. So I think when we see the US government really talk about building allied resilience, I think it's a really important piece given its location, as George mentioned, in the Indo-Pacific, but also the ability to provide infrastructure and production capability for other allies, whether it's the UK and Japan and other friendlies, without sort of having to navigate some of the regulatory challenges that a lot of export faces as far as the US is concerned. So I think providing a complementary supply chain that not only enforces US objectives around space security, but also helps work with other allies. I think Australia, I feel, has a growing and an important role to play.
If I can just add a couple of specifics on that, right? Under AUKUS Pillar 2, space isn't specifically called out. I think it would be incredible if it was. I think that would really help sort of activate Australia to doing more faster under this. I think, the Space Force leadership in respect of sort of articulating what the future needs to look like, and then maybe putting some sort of pressure on Australia to be able to do more around this would be really helpful to getting a stronger response down here in this market. And I think that, there is no doubt that one of our strengths as the allies is the the way that we work together is how we are strong. And I think a strong Australian space ecosystem that's actually building the things that America needs for things like Golden Dome and other initiatives makes us a stronger alliance. And I think that's really important.
Yeah, all great points. And I appreciate that perspective because, again, in no other domain besides space is seeing the blurring of lines between commercial, civil, and national security. And so as we march down this path, clarity is going to provide the future vision that we know we need for our partners and allies. So I appreciate that perspective coming from the commercial standpoint that you represent down there in Australia and the geopolitical climate there. Looking ahead, what are the next major milestones for Space Machines in the next year or two?
So for us, the biggest milestones is, we are going to be launching Optimus Viper, which is our rapid response vehicle, into orbit, and really demonstrating the ability for it to get very close to a target object, characterize it, provide streaming data down to customers, and then provide a software command and control layer to fulfill the entire mission objective. So that's one, and it's a commercial mission, whilst we're also developing a national security mission at the same time to prove the complementary technology with a customer on how we achieve the same outcome with a slightly different application. And so for us, those two missions become really, really important. And the third one, really starting to think about how do you apply all of those learning lessons into GEO. GEO is a key strategic orbit, not just GEO, but then ex-GEO. There is an increasing focus on what happens beyond GEO and what's going to happen with cislunar and lunar orbits going into the future and how strategic they are to the allies. And so for us, the focus is very quickly demonstrate both commercial and national security outcomes, but then move very quickly into GEO and above GEO.
I think, Hippie, the other major milestone that we will achieve is the sort of production facility to be able to produce 20 spacecraft per year will be up and running next year. And then we're now working on a blueprint for a sort of modular factory design that will enable us to produce 100 per year and then actually roll that factory design out to scale production either further. So, we've got the demonstrator missions that prove the capability, but then it's the manufacturing industrial scale up that's really important to be able to deliver these at volume in 2 to 3 years from now.
That's a tremendous vision and milestones you guys set forward for your team. Let's talk about the team for a moment. Space is a difficult environment to operate in. It's a difficult environment to create capabilities to be in on a regular basis. So what keeps you and the team motivated when the challenges start to pile up?
Well, mate, let me tell you, the challenges are hard. I remember when Raj first called me about this back in 2018. I'd been doing retail consumer technology before then. I thought, wow, this is just an engineering problem. It's got to be easier than dealing with a whole lot of consumers and what they think. That was probably misinformed back then. This is really hard. Space is hard, right? It's all about mindset. It's a purposeful mission. The people that love space and love the outcome of what we're trying to build, they're motivated by the mission and the cause and the purpose. So, when we're thinking about the resilience and leadership required to sort of keep a team together and deal with the inevitable sort of hurdles that come about it, you have to be focused on mindset and purpose and continuing to really articulate and drive for that vision. And it's hard. Some people get a bit burnt out on that journey. As leaders, right? It sort of core to our purpose as people now. I'm speaking on behalf of Raj. Like, this is an important mission. We've got to get it done. We've got to inspire the team to be part of that. And that's what drives us to overcome the inevitable challenges that have occurred and the ones that will occur.
I think that's, absolutely. And look, I think for us, the team, when things get tough, I think getting to solve some genuinely hard technical problems that really challenge your, from first principles, everything, I think that inspires a lot of the team. And I think we have two values in the company that are very dear to us. And when we hire, we are putting them at the center of that process, which is one is starry-eyed. when things get hard, you've got to believe in the possibilities of space and what space means to humanity, and you've got to be really aligned with that. And I think the second one is really around curiosity. We call it humble zeal, which is you've got to be you got to have the zeal to keep going when things get really difficult, but you got to be driven by humility to have the curiosity to say I could be wrong, and by virtue of I could be wrong, you find new solutions and creative solutions to keep going. And so for us, like, binding that at the heart of who we are is super important, especially in a capital-starved and non-space heritage geography where we've not had 50 years of space heritage, where some of our colleagues, companies in the US can go to Apollo graveyards and pick up pieces and sort of, use them for testing. We've got to sort of find really innovative solutions, maybe, and really access the non-space part of the Australian workforce to kind of make that happen.
No, that's a really good point. We talk about it over here in the US, and the metric I think I'm tracking is less than 10% of the US know that the Space Force exists.
Right.
And, and even less than that probably even know what the Space Force does, because
Wow.
we've not had to demonstrate resilience in a wartime environment. And by the way, nobody wants a war that starts or extends into space. Everybody wants to ensure space is free to use for everybody. And that being said, it's got to be underpinned by a strong national security apparatus to ensure commercial companies like yours have the ability to continue to operate and support national security interests. So it definitely is unique. You said humbled zeal. I always use the term tempered passion. You got to be passionate about the mission and temperate in the reality that the mission is going to take a while to accomplish. So I completely agree with you, Raj. From a leadership perspective, what have each of you learned about building a team capable of thriving in such a demanding industry?
That's a great question, Hippie.
Yeah, I think it's a great question. I think alignment to mission is at the top of it. I think being plugged into why we're trying to do what we're trying to do, the path that we're taking, the doctrine of how we're approaching the problem and how we want to solve it. I think having a team and a leadership that is super aligned to that is probably the most critical part of it. And I think over the last 5 years, 6 years, we've been on a journey to, by failures, understand that, by leadership failures, by, hiring practices, understanding how we work with people. I think for us, that's been the biggest challenge is, getting a group of people that believes the same things, understands what needs to be done with the constraints we have, and then being able to apply that constantly with velocity. And I think velocity is the heart of this, which is, you could be the smartest person and you could be the smartest leaders, but velocity and that fearlessness to say, well, we're going to try this thing. It's not going to work, but the speed at which we do this is going to matter. And I don't think that's for everyone. And I think that's something that as a leadership, both at least from my perspective, and I'm speaking a little bit on George's behalf here, so it's like from our perspective as leadership, but then also that leadership flowing down to the broader team. I think that's been a really big challenge, but also I think in the long term it's going to be a strength to really embed that velocity. The thing about velocity engineering, velocity decision making.
I think, I've had a really key insight probably in the last 4 or 5 months on this topic, Hippie, around mindset, right? Like, so, I've always been higher for capabilities and expertise, but what I've really now focused on and understood the importance of is mindset. And, I'm going to name check an American organization, BuildMo, and the team there who really highlighted this to me was that, the mindset to be able to make progress with constrained resources. So I have this mantra now when I'm talking to my team: what can we do today with constrained resources, right, to still make progress on the mission? Like, what can I get done today? And it's like, it's better to be wrong tomorrow than wrong in 4 weeks. So this velocity mindset, hire for mindset, coach and help the team who could have the right mindset to get that right mindset. And I think one of the things that's come out of, operating in an environment where there's not a lot of capital is that we've now built a mindset and a model and a leadership style that I think will embed frugality into what we're building, which is an important part of sort of hitting the price point that we want. So yeah, that mindset to me is the key aspect of leadership for something as hard as this.
Yeah, those are great points. And we see it, you probably see it on a daily basis in terms of the challenges you're faced with and the team's faced with. So now let's pivot to the future. In 5 to 10 years, what does the orbital logistics landscape look like? Do you envision a day when in-space refueling, repairs, or debris removal are routine operations?
I think that in 10 years time, 10, 15 years time, I think the way I think about the successful paradigm for any logistics network is distribution, and a distributed distributed way to think about it. So I think looking out, you see nodes of logistic capability available in orbit, in different orbits that are creating not only an Earth to space, but a space to space and orbit to orbit network, and the capability to service to refuel being available at the edge where customers need it. And I think that will require the key underpinning of all of that will be the cost to maneuver. Freedom of movement is going to be key to that. And so, from my perspective, a logistic network that can service multiple orbits, multiple customers across multiple countries in a safe, secure way will require that freedom of movement in orbit, security, and how do we achieve that as we start to deliver, servicing, life extensions, commercial space stations, and the rest of it. So I think from my perspective, at the heart of that logistics network is going to be, and that's the primary thesis we have, is security in any logistics network is paramount. And so our ability to provide resilient architecture to provide that security for the logistics future is going to be not only providing that capability to customers, but it will also lower the cost for everyone involved, because now you're starting to build a supply chain and industrial base that can produce those components at very low price.
Hippie, when I think about the future, I always like to think about the great book series and series on Amazon, Expanse, which is a great look into the future of what space looks like. I think definitely in 10 to 15 years we will have made some progress towards that. And I think it's inevitable, that there is a shared allied network of spacecraft that are in orbit already that you can call upon for an inspection and protection service. Space is a problem of the commons, like the ocean is, but it's a little bit different. So everyone has a Coast Guard because the Coast Guard helps to assure the freedom of movement on the ocean. There is no doubt that to achieve an economically rational ability to provide inspection and protection services and have the logistics you need on orbit, you need a shared infrastructure of very low-cost spacecraft that enable that to happen, and therefore you need a shared production capability to enable that network to exist.
Yeah, great points. And what's happening is, as we see, is technology is racing ahead of regulation in many areas. How can companies like Space Machines lead responsibly, ensuring safety, sustainability, and transparency in orbit?
Oh, look, that's a great question. I mean, it is so far ahead of regulation, right? And, it's hard to imagine regulation really keeping up with it. I think, when I reflect on that, Hippie, I'm going to go back to the beginning, right? Like, the system of systems that has to emerge in space for safe space to be safeguarded and free and available for everyone to use. That is a complex system of systems with governments and regulations in place. It's really important that you've got really good actors who are working on this problem in terms of the companies and the leaders and the organizations that are trying to build this infrastructure, because technology is ahead of regulation. And then they need to engage with regulators in sort of pathfinder activities. If you're the first one building a shared service in orbit for rapid response or, Orbitside Assist, call it Roadside Assist, you're going to be pulling the regulators in that direction. So I think responsible companies and leaders that are doing the right thing in orbit and then working with the regulators to pull them along to support what that future system looks like is absolutely critical. And we talked obviously to a few space agencies in Australia and other countries with what we're doing. And I think that it's the innovators like us and similar companies that are actually opening the art of the possible to them about what they do need to regulate.
And I think I think to add to that, when I think about sustainability and being responsible, especially when technology outpaces regulation by that much, and the pace at which it's doing it, I think it's an individual responsibility, like how we think about the use of our technology, being safe in orbit. So things like passive safety ellipse operations in orbit. How are we enabling our systems as we build to inbuild safety as part of that? And so that there is a safety and sustainability at the individual organization level. I think the glue that ties it all together is though a common vision for the future of space. I think that is super important because that allows the regulation to catch up. And I think working together to figure out that this is what we want for the future of space, whether that's freedom of movement or responsible use of orbits, or how do we apply that common vision to the use of lunar resources. I think all of that start to play in it. And I think there are some that would believe that space is only space is inherently needs to be contested. And some of those adversaries starting to think about space with a very different vision. I think the power that we have as allies is to have that common vision and then distribute that common vision to our companies, to our organizations, to our space agencies, and that will proliferate the law and the regulation to catch up. I think the danger we currently face is if we don't align ourselves very quickly for what that common future is that we all see, then it's harder to fight the adversary.
Yeah. It's we talk about adversarial capabilities and technologies that are on orbit today, holding at risk some exquisite capabilities that, if taken away, would render life as we know it non-existent. So I call it the capability knowledge gap that exists in what I'm saying is the first space native generation. That is to say, the first generation to never know a day without space is currently in existence. And this generation doesn't realize that, we've relied on space technologies so much that if we lose them, it's going to cause chaos around the globe.
Yep.
And we don't want that, again, going back to that point. And so we've got to maintain a resilient architecture and, to your point, utilize the partnerships and allies and the companies that are bringing that type of technology forward. So really appreciate both of your vision and leadership. Before we wrap up, I always like to end with a big picture question. If you could leave our listeners, especially those serving in or supporting the U.S. Space Force and allied space communities, with one key message about the future of space power and infrastructure, what would it be?
Well, that's a great question, Hippie. And I mean, I'd just firstly like to say a big thank you to those who are serving in Space Force and the leadership, and also those in the UK, and the clarity of the message coming from the likes of Major General Tedman and General Saltzman about the risks to our in-space infrastructure. The message that I would leave is that we can't leave any stone unturned in the pursuit of urgently building the infrastructure in orbit to protect that critical infrastructure upon which we rely for life on Earth, and the industrial scale that we need across the allies to ensure we can continue to produce the different types of spacecraft needed to enable the warfighters and guardians to be able to provide that layer of protection to that infrastructure on orbit. I think it's one of the single most important problems that we face on this planet. So we're committed to that cause, and again, very grateful to those that serve who are pursuing that objective.
And I think, Bill, from my perspective, I think you mentioned something very important there, just before, about how space underpins everything. And I think from my perspective, if I want to leave some message, I think, space underpins everything we do. more than we know, it will be attacked first, and we're not ready. And what we've got to figure out is how do we deliver both space security and by that superiority? And the only way I believe we can do that is we can't keep building space infrastructure like we're building today. We've got to change how we build space infrastructure. We've got to be focused on attritable platforms, rapid production, and that gives us, persistent presence in space. So I think thinking about space as critical infrastructural domain is at the heart of this. I think we've got to believe that, the biggest threat we face and an asymmetric threat we face to everything we do on Earth is underpinned by space data and space services. So I think in some way, what the Guardians are doing is the most important thing right now is protecting infrastructure that we all believe is not important, but it's probably at the heart and in the weakest link in our chain. So I think again, thank all the Guardians and servicemen for this, what they do, but at the same time, I think raising the profile of, yes, the other domains are important, but 10 years from now, space will be at the heart of everything we do. And so I think we've got to protect it and we've got to get onto it fast.
Great points. If there was only a conference that was hosted once a year where companies can come together, both internationally and nationally, and talk about these big problems, that would be phenomenal. I'm of course giving you guys a hard time. SFA hosts the Spacepower conference. I know it doesn't align with your two respective calendars this year, but we know Space Machines is going to be there. The president of the U.S. Space Machines company is going to be in attendance, so we're looking forward to hosting her down in Orlando next month. Raj, George, it's been great. I really do appreciate having you both on the Spacepower podcast. Your vision for sustainable, serviceable space infrastructure is inspiring, and I know our listeners will be following Space Machines Company closely as you continue to build a foundation for the next era of orbital operations. Thanks again for joining us, and thanks to everyone for listening. Any closing comments?
I'd just like to say a big thanks, Hippie, for having us on, and also we look forward to seeing a branch of Space Force Association in Australia in due course. I think it would be good for our space ecosystem down here to have Space Force Association in Australia.
I hear that. Thank you, George. And Raj, any closing comments?
Thanks for hosting us, Sibi, and really appreciate it. I think I agree that I think we've got to bring together companies and organizations in a forum globally that align with that vision of future space together. If not yearly, maybe every 2 years, because I think it's super important. We all sort of walk away with the same vision and the problems we're trying to solve.
Thank you both again. And for everyone listening, be sure to subscribe, leave a review, and join us next time as we continue exploring the technologies and leaders driving the future of space power. Until next time, Semper Supra.